Hello. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be. We're going to be getting started here in just a minute. And we're just going to give you some time for some participants to join. But we're looking forward to our live online webinar and book launch from Harold Davis. And I see the participants rolling in, which is good news. I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes before I do a brief introduction and provide some housekeeping. Hi, guys. Welcome, Gail from Alberta. Mike from Phoenix. I see we have folks from Germany and Sweden. Fantastic. Belgium, Indiana. And from the UK. That's where I am right now. And from Londonderry in Northern Ireland. Hi, Edwin. And Ottawa, Tenerife. Wow, it really is a global event tonight. It's great to see. We have a bunch of folks from Canada. And the Netherlands. Okay, well, guys, I'm gonna start with my introduction here, and this has been recorded so folks can catch up if they're unable to join immediately or need to jump off early. But just a couple of housekeeping items. We will be recording the webinar, so all of the registrants can watch at their leisure. If folks have questions during the presentation, you can enter those in the Q&A, which is at the bottom toolbar. Harold will address these either at an appropriate time during the webinar or at the Q&A section at the end. The presentation will be roughly 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. I see people still rolling in here. Philadelphia, Columbia, South Carolina. I'd like to quickly introduce myself. So I'm your host tonight. I say tonight because I'm based in the UK and it's evening here. And I work with Rocky Nook. It's a real pleasure tonight to welcome you to this book launch and webinar. We have an incredible 500 folks who have registered for this event, which is pretty jaw-dropping and really great to see. For those of you who are new to Rocky Nook, we're a small independent publisher of photography books. We were founded in 2006 with the goal of helping photographers at all levels to improve their skills in capturing those moments that matter. Recently, we've taken our passion for creativity and for creating well-crafted, beautiful books, and we've brought that to new areas. So now we publish books on drawing, painting, design. So that's Rocky Nook, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are already familiar with us. But now on to the main event. We're delighted and honored to welcome Harold Davis as we celebrate his new Rocky Nook book, Composition and Photography, Working with Photography Using Design Concepts. Please note, I will be sharing an exclusive code in the chat for you to purchase Harold's book at an exclusive discount if you so desire, just to let you know about that. But on to Harold. So in addition to being a prolific author and instructor, Harold is an accomplished and critically acclaimed photographer and artist, having just been awarded the Photographic Society of America's prestigious Progress Award. Previous recipients of this award include Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, Gordon Parks, and Ken Burns. So Harold's in very esteemed company with that award. It's a delightful accomplishment. In addition, Harold has had the recent honor of 2 of his stunning images, Tulips and Sunflower Bouquet, being featured on new United States Postal Service stamps. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mantle over to Harold for his talk, Creating Structure Using Forms and Patterns. So just bear with me 1 second. I will pass control to Harold. And I will remove myself.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? I hope so. You never know when you're talking into the void of Zoom webinars, but it's great that we can do this all together all around the world. It's good to see everyone. It's good to see old friends, new friends. And thank you so much, Damon, for the flattering introduction. I really appreciate it. I hope we all have a good time here. As Damon says, this is the book launch, the formal book launch for my new book, which is ghosting out of my webinar, Composition and Photography. And it's kind of been a supply chain issue with getting the book out here, so it's great to launch it. Without much further ado, though, since you didn't come here to see me, you came here to see, well, I'm not sure what you came here to see, but I am going to share my screen. And that's because that's what it's all about. So give me 1 second here to get this together. And here we go. So creating structure using forms and patterns. When you start to think about digital photography, you can change lots and lots and lots of things about a photograph in post-production, and I'm delighted to do so often. The one thing that is closest to immutable is the composition. So as I've been thinking about photography over the years, as a practicing photographer, I came to the idea that it was really important to start to consider composition as a kind of premier part of it, right along with things like exposure and so on, because what you can do with composition is something that you can't do anywhere else. So the next question that came up in my mind was, how are you going to approach composition in a kind of intelligible kind of way? Because there are all these touchy-feely things, and there are also all these sort of inapplicable rules. And I say inapplicable. Rules may be guidelines and not rules, but there's no formula that's going to work for every kind of composition. For example, the famous or infamous rule of thirds. Well, you know, that's great in certain kinds of landscapes and seascapes, and maybe for classical seascape paintings or something like that. Put the horizon line at a third of the way down. But there are a lot of kinds of images that it just doesn't work for. I want to point out that Rocky Nook is not a huge corporate company. They're a very nice set of individuals who publish photography books. Not only have they published composition and photography, but they've also published creative garden photography and the making of great photos of flowers, gardens, landscapes, and the beautiful world around us, and also creative black and white, the second edition of that book. And the discount code that Damon and I are going to provide at the end of this webinar will work for all these books. I urge you to purchase the books, if you should decide to do so, directly from the publisher rather than from a certain unnamed warehousing, well, let's call it Amazon. It's fine, you can get it there if you want, but if you go directly to the publisher, it will do wonders for the publisher and for me, as opposed to going through Amazon. You heard it here first. So Edward Weston said, to consult the rules of composition before making a picture is a little like consulting the law of gravitation before going for a walk. Edward Weston is surely one of my great photographic heroes. If you're not familiar with his wonderful work, I suggest you do take a look. What does he mean? What did he mean? He meant that, you know, you're not going to be studying a cheat sheet, composition for dummies, as you go out there, hold it up to your face, composition for dummies. Okay, here's how I make this photo. No, it's kind of more like listening to music. You're out there, or you're in the studio, or you're working on a light box or something like that, and something sings to you and says, this is a composition. And of course, what is a composition doing? It's taking a piece of the world, our wonderful three-dimensional world that's out there, and putting it within a kind of two-dimensional frame because of an image on a computer or in a photographic print. And by the way, I urge everyone to print their work. It's a great way to really see it. It's a rendering of a piece of the world rendered from three-dimensional into two dimensions. So the idea of using design principles, the principles that have been thought about and developed for a long time for two-dimensional design as what one does with a photograph makes good sense. You can't quote Edward Weston without also quoting Ansel Adams. And as you'll see, I have another Adams quote at the end of the presentation, but he says, there are no rules for good photographs, only good photographs. In some ways, my photographs and those of other people that most interest me are different in some undefinable way with the composition. It's about seeing something in a new and creative way. And if I do anything that matters to me as a teacher, and if you get anything out of this presentation, it's going to be that the art of composition is developing your own creativity to see things in new ways. That's what I most want to convey. The only rule is that there are no rules. Okay, fine. Composition is a process, not a hard and fast set of rules. As part of that, when I go and make a photograph in my studio or on location or wherever it is, you know, the Japanese mountains behind me on the Kii Peninsula in Japan, I was standing in a spot called View of 10,000 Peaks. You don't just get there and make the image, make the composition. You wander around, you sniff, you look up, you look down, you feel the air, you let the composition find you. Another way of looking at this is another Ansel Adams quote, basically. He said something like, sometimes I'm in a location at a time where God has set me there to press the shutter. So this is important in several respects. You have to know when that time is right, when it's right to be at the shore of a lake at sunrise or something like that. And you have to be open to it. The underlying structure of composition is made through shapes and patterns, starting with, as we'll see, with the simplest kinds of shapes. Expect the unexpected. Leave room for serendipity in your compositional practice. Pre-visualization is hugely important, but you will also want to be able to find new things as you pre-visualize. What does pre-visualization mean, by the way? Pre-visualization is the craft or art of knowing where you're going to end up after you go through the long tunnel of snapping the picture in the real time in the camera, bringing it back to the computer, processing it, coming out with something. How do you know where you're going to end up? Often what my images look like are very different than where I started. I should say also that I do invite dialogue in my presentations. So if there are questions or comments, I will have a session at the end for them, but I'm also open to addressing them now. And let me see if what's here.
So Harold, Mark has asked, would you agree that to ignore the rules of composition is to first know the rules of composition?
Mark, that's very logical. It sounds logical, but it's not really me. Because I think that there are some people out there who've been pretty gifted artists and photographers and who are more intuitive about it. I believe in the power of intuition. So yeah, how can you know the rules if there are no rules? Good question, something to think about. It's a great question. It's a great logical reduction here, but I'm not 100% sure that it's something I live by. Damon, is there another one there? I see two up there, but I don't quite know how to open them.
No, Harold, the first one was just saying that you were looking great.
Well, that's a great question. Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is a open ferry bridge here. A line across. Circles here. You can also look at this circle as a dot. Simplest shapes of all in compositions are lines and dots. Here with this extreme close-up in a tulip, the main part of the composition, the thrust of the composition is a center line going down the thing. This is underneath a boat in a dockyard looking up. What the subject matter is doesn't matter so much, but the composition is essentially comprised of a set of converging lines, including the center line. Power towers with lines, converging lines coming in, lines going up, and of course the horizontal across, that's the kind of holding line behind the pond here. This fence and shadow is again converging set of lines with these kind of rectangles in between. So at the very early stage of the shapes, design shapes within compositions, look for lines, straight or curvilinear, and dots. George O'Keeffe made a big deal about the dots. Here you have on a large scale, this is like 500 feet, 125 meters of these curved lines that are the shape of the hills and the shadows. And when I processed this, I processed it to exaggerate the difference, to make the lines in it more apparent. And this one from Zabriskie Point in Death Valley, the same thing. Here with the line of the sand dune in Eureka Dunes in Death Valley, you see the dark and the light of the line coming down like that. And here, again, across lines, with the bright sun at the background. And another kind of line. This is Rainbow Bridge at the bottom of Tokyo Harbor. Here you have the curved line of the bridge, the curved line of the upper bridge, and also the building going up with the lines across the building. The world is made of lines and dots. Even when the line is like looking out this kind of slightly creepy attic window like this one, or in Valletta, Malta, the line of the street going out to the edge of the old town there. The lines of the river, lines of the towers going up in this old kind of Moroccan place. Here's a big dot. Does anyone recognize this? It's the dot of the Earth. I did not make this photo. It's a NASA photo, public domain, high resolution satellite image of our wonderful Earth. But if you presented this as a much, much smaller, the smaller it gets, the more it becomes a dot. And so everything ultimately is made up with dots. I'm reading a comment I see from Jack. Looking at a lot of art helps imbue one with the principle subliminally. At least that's what I think. And yes, I like looking at a lot of art. I've looked at a lot of art in my life, and I agree with that comment rings true to me, although one also has to put one's own creativity into the mix. I think that's part of what what Edward Weston was saying with his gravity remark, that he's got a lot of it subliminally, so he doesn't have to regurgitate it on a cheat sheet. The key ideas about lines. Lines are simple. A well-designed line can take you everywhere. The basic element of many compositions, they have an implied direction. You look at art, you learn to see the lines in compositions. It's a skill that takes some practice. You can use that in your own work, and your work can become richer if you internalize how lines interact, work together, and form visual direction. And when I do pre-visualization and practice post-production, I try to look for the lines and make them more part of the composition. I use post-production techniques. If you think of that image I showed of the underneath of the boat, I am to some extent responsible for the boldness of the lines and things like that. You can use a contrast to make lines much more apparent. This Icelandic waterfall, it's 3 lines really coming down. I mentioned before that minute differences in the relationship of your camera to the subject make a huge difference. And in the book, in composition and photography, this is a reproduction of a figure from the book. I call it scooching. So it makes a difference in terms of what's in focus and depth of field, but it also makes a huge difference in composition. One good friend of mine who's really a good photographer put it this way. He said, I get to a place and I look around and I spend at least a half hour looking at all angles before I even think too hard about what my compositions are. So scooch. When you get to work, scooch before you settle on a composition. Some more shapes. Circles, triangles, rectangles. We all know these shapes. They're all basic to us, going back at least to kindergarten and maybe beyond. But our images are made up of them. Here's a circle that's a traffic circle in Barcelona, in Catalonia. I think the most difficult issue in making this image was finding the right car trails, the lights of the cars, to echo the circle in the center, because it would have been lonely just with the blue light from the fountain. And if the lines coming through had just been the straight car lines, that also wouldn't have worked so well. So I waited until my long exposure could incorporate a car circling around the roundabout as well as the circle in the center. So circles can echo each other, which become a very powerful compositional motif, like with this egg on a white little dishlet. This was from our pandemic era fruit slicing on a light box exercises. These are mostly apple, but also lime and kiwi slices, and arranged in a concentric circle, or what I call in the book a mandala shape. So a mandala is a circular pattern. In tradition, it can represent the universe, sacred space, wholeness, used for meditation. I have quite a bit of material on mandalas in my book, and I'm very fond of circular mandala patterns when I get the chance to create them, particularly on the light box, or sometimes when I see them in real life. This is looking down a parfait glass manifested as a mandala. Here's a LAB L-channel inversion of a bunch of leaves, alstroemeria petals, and other kinds of things like that on a light box. This is an X-ray of a sunflower. So literally it's an X-ray. People ask me, what did you take this with? I took it with a mammography X-ray machine, probably the most expensive camera I've ever used. My understanding is it's about $250,000. And then you can read the file in Photoshop that you get. And I'm very excited because I'm going to get to do some more X-rays coming up in a couple of weeks. Here's essentially a mandala shape, the top of a papaver, a poppy pod, the papaver somniferum, an opium poppy. This is the Alter Brook in Heidelberg, Germany, the ancient bridge across the Neckar River. And so here you see these concentric, not concentric, but these progressive circles going down. In the book, I have a diagram of what the shape, compositional shape is here, because it's really pretty straightforward to understand what's going on here with the ovoid, almost circle shapes of successively smaller sizes going down to the horizon line on the right. And a similar kind of shape. This one happens to be the Pont Filantre near Cahors in the southwest of France, but these are also based on the sort of similarity of the ovoid shapes going back. A circle is a very significant, important shape as a portal, a door you can go out of. Here, this is a kind of door in a cave, in Son Doong Cave in Vietnam, near the Laotian border, called a dough line, where you look out the entrance of the cave at this great kind of hole in the jungle, and it's reflected down in the water in the cave. Paris rooftops, and here you have all this is just made up of shapes. It's rectangles, triangles, and wonderful shapes in an old bristlecone pine. And here you can diagram this outside of the old dome in Pavia, Italy, with the lines going up. So another pandemic image, very simple sun coming through, 4 squares on the left, light on the top, 4 squares on the right, and there you go. So Damon, any questions before I go on to the next section?
So Harold, there was a question about a piece of terminology that you used, scooch. And the gentleman or lady, it's an anonymous, says, do you mean getting things in the same focal plane or not?
Well, I thank you. If you look up scooch in the Urban Dictionary, you're going to find a meaning that I definitely don't mean. But leaving that aside, so you can use a scooching essentially to getting the focal plane parallel to your subject, which from a technical viewpoint is an important issue of maximizing the depth of field in an image. However, I go far beyond that, because I'm also interested in scooching to create a more interesting composition. And what's truly amazing, it's just so amazing, you move the camera an inch or two in a different direction and you have a completely different composition. This is so cool. This is so awesome. It's what it's all about. So thank you for the very interesting question. Damon, anything else?
Not right now, Harold.
Thank you. So frames. What is a frame? Well, okay, I've got my glasses. It's a frame, sort of. But everything in a photograph is within a frame. That's the outer frame of the photograph. People get confused by this. I'm not talking about the thing that holds the picture on the wall. That's a kind of frame too. This is a word with lots of meaning. But as photographers, what we have to understand is that two-dimensional design in a photograph means our photograph is always in a frame, but we can put other frames within it, as I did in this Photoshop composition showing all kinds of stairs and whatnot. But there are at least 2 and probably 4 or 5 frames here that are outside the meat of this composition, with the inner meat being a heart And then you've got the lighter things outside it. Here again, this is a photograph of a print of this image, of this down the rabbit hole image here, where the inspiration is, of course, something like Escher. And okay, so there's the outer frame of the photo. There's the white frame. There's a frame within that. There's a frame within that. Understanding internal framing is an important part of advanced composition. This is under the Yaquina Bay Bridge on the coast of Oregon. And here, there's we're going to leave the question of the outer photo frame out of these, but inside this is the first keyhole kind of window into the structure of the bridge. And then beyond that, another keyhole. And beyond that, you really see the workings of the bridge. By the way, as a side note here, I do find myself photographing under bridges a great deal. With this one, I constructed the inner image is a multiple exposure of a model on a black background. And I then constructed a tin type frame and I put that on a white background. This Photoshop composite of a lightbox image of popovers, of poppies, with the L channel inversion of those poppies is a play on frames, because what you're doing here is you're peeling the inner frame off from the outer frame. And the same thing here. This is a composite of 3 photographs, really. So there's the photograph of the black back wall. Then there's a light box photograph, which I've used with a couple of LAB variations, with the back side and the front side showing via the Photoshop curl. And the thumbtacks, or push pins, which is one photograph of one push pin rotated, photographed in very different scale, and in Photoshop scaled down to fit on there. This is what I call a fusion X-ray. It's 50% an X-ray of popovers, roses, and ranunculi on a light, and it's 50% a light box photo of the same composition combined. So it shows both the inside and the outside of these flowers. So every chapter in the book has a thought experiment. Here's the thought experiment for frames. Can you construct a photo that does not have a border of a frame? And I don't think you can, but write me if you think you can. What would this look like? How would you create this image without borders in the real world? That leads to a sort of philosophic question. Does everything have an edge, a beginning, and an end? Question. Here's a frame that I photographed specifically for the book. So this is obviously intended as a frame. You could put whatever you want inside it, a light box image. Color is great. I love color, but if you rely on it for composition, you're going to get in trouble. It's a cheap date. You know, here are these tulips. I often try to understand whether I have good bones of a great composition by doing a monochromatic conversion. Does it work in monochrome? If it doesn't work in monochrome, probably you're trying to rely on color too much. Monochrome is wonderful. You gotta love monochrome.
Harold?
Yes.
Jax has a question. Is there an affordable way to create X-rays?
If you find out, tell me. Find a friend who's a radiologist. Seriously, that's how that's mostly how I've done it. I also was able to get access to one of the really, really high-tech pieces of equipment at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs for a couple of photos that, you can find them on my website. But for the most part, my friend Julian Kopfka is a radiologist and doctor in Heidelberg, Germany, and the X-rays that I'm showing are things I created using the gear in his practice after hours. I don't know that there's any other way. And kids, if you try this at home, be careful. These things are dangerous. X-rays, that is. So, you know, it's really wonderful to be able to play with them. There's some issues about understanding how to expose them because it is more to do with the density of the materials than with conventional photographs. But I don't know any way short of having a friend who is a professional in the field, a radiologist, or maybe a technician with access to the gear. I wish I did, because it is really a blast understanding what's inside the thing. Again, part of what I look for in my imagery, made whatever way, is to show people things that you can't see otherwise, that are different, that are unexpected, that are ineffable, that you can't quite explain. And for us, since our vision, usually we don't have X-ray vision, we aren't born with it, unfortunately, that what you see out of an X-ray machine is truly meets that criteria often. So we're showing a lot of monochromatic images that work as compositions without color. This one of this mysterious islet in San Francisco Bay is a nighttime photo taken about midnight under moonlight, under moon cover. You can tell that it's a night photo by the running lights on the trawler that's in the background on the right. Often it's sort of like X-rays in a way. What happens when you are in situations with unusual light is that you can make images that you don't quite expect. So I look for things where the light is foggy, where it's not quite so obvious what's going on. And in fact, in general, that's one of the principles of composition, besides understanding shapes and so on, is to consider how you're going to make something mysterious rather than straightforward. Damon, before I go on to positive space, negative space, any questions at this point?
No, Harold, you're good to go on.
Positive space, negative space, which is which? Well, that's a good question. So a very powerful thing to play with in your compositions is positive space and negative space. I made this photo lying down in the gutter in Havana, Cuba, but that doesn't really much matter. The question is, do you see buildings here or a cross in the sky? This inside Xondong, the cave, is an example of positive space, negative space play in an image, because, you know, you look at it literally, you see the guy with the headlamp, the porter with the headlamp over there on the rock, that's fine. But then you have the outside world there, and which is positive and which is negative. These people sunning themselves on a steep dock on the Ligurian coast, there's a positive space, negative space, and the shadows that they cast. So nothing could exist without its opposite. Can you have good without evil? What does it even mean? Could you have darkness without light? Positive space and negative space in a composition give rise to these thoughts. This is in Kyoto, a temple and a temple garden. And the garden represents a rainstorm, a rain cloud with drops of water reflecting metaphorically. And then what I did was I created the composition to put the shadow of the temple roof against it. So you can use things like gaps, windows, shadows to create a sense of what's the positive space, what's the negative space, or even in a somewhat unusual composition like this one in central Hanoi with the Turtle Tower Temple there, it's really small between the leaves, but the branches are they positive or are they negative? And you take this really far, this is a optical illusion known as Rubens vase, but in this case, it's Harold's vase because, I don't know, that's my profile there. An important thing to think about in composition is visual entering and exiting. In almost every image, every painting, every photo, everything else, there is a place where people go into the composition visually, and there is a place where they leave it. most there's a predominance of entering in lower left and leaving in the upper right, but that's by no means universally true. With this one, it's pretty clear that you enter at the center of the flower, and then you leave either up or down the cleft of light going up or down. Here with Godafoss in Iceland, there are two visual paths. You can start, well, I can't point at it really, but you start on the mid lower left and go around the waterfall and then go out at the sunset, or perhaps you follow the sunset down to the waterfall. Either way, it's worth thinking about where you're guiding the viewer to look in your photo. So that's part of what you are as a photographer, as a creative photographer working with composition. You are a guide to help people know how to track through your images. There's a fair amount of discussion of this in the book, and we're just hitting the top of it here. But with this image from the Brooklyn Bridge in New York City, I'm looking down the lights of the bridge toward the skyline, and then I go out of the image either left or right where the roadway visually hits the bridge. It's very important to think about exiting and entering, and there are some exercises and so on about this in my book. Symmetry, asymmetry, partial symmetry, these are things I look for in composition. There's a sense of wholeness about something that's symmetrical, continues to work even if you're only partially symmetrical, can work where it's something like these beet slices where it's designed, or it can work without it. What would the world be like without symmetry? How would we feel? How bound up with our sense of beauty is symmetry? These are partial symmetry images that have to do with splits in path. So once you have something like a dot or a line or a triangle or whatever, or circle, the question becomes, how can you build that up? And patterns and repetition are the mechanism for building that up in a straight shot down a curve, like this bicycle rack on the UC Berkeley campus, probably only possible in the early part of the pandemic, where nobody was parking bikes anywhere anymore because nothing was open. So I got down there and scooched down on the ground and made that repetitious image. With the model here, my instructions are communication. The model and I were, let's make this a symmetrical image and give you as many arms as we can. So her task was to hold the arm during this multiple exposure as close to the same way on each shot. And here with this Photoshop composition, I intentionally created an image that's symmetrical on all these different axes. And here I just went crazy. Again, with this image, the idea was, with the model and myself, was to work out symmetry so that there's axes where the hand position is the same going either way. Symmetry has huge power, and repetition does as well. This is the image here is based on a repetition where it's a single multiple exposure photograph, one model moving through, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different poses, essentially the same pose each time, although you can see her facial expressions do change. And here with this one, the pattern was see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. And the model started down on the ground and went up. And there are, it's nine different poses in one photograph. Nature itself, of course, does a wonderful example of symmetry with this dahlia. And sometimes what's a lot of fun is to take something like these apple slices and say, hey, there's always one that breaks the pattern, like the one with the stem up there. Patterns, repetition, urban repetition. This is downtown Palermo in Sicily. And these umbrellas on the street in Tokyo in the rain, and in Romania. Spirals, fractals, complex patterns that are really fun to work with. here are two different spirals meeting, the Nautilus shell in nature and the stairs going up. Like many artists and photographers, I'm totally mad about spirals in nature and in humanity. Here's an X-ray of the Nautilus, the last one, a conventional photo of the Nautilus, an X-ray of two Nautilus halves, and a pandemic flower spiral on the light box, dahlias and fuchsias. So there's fractal art, and the photographs are not really fractal art, which are generated using equations, but in nature, a fractal is a curve or shape which is similar in small part to the larger parts of the shape. For example, trees, and trees often grow fractally, so you've only got one or two possible choices as parts of the tree grow. And there's something very, since fractal reproduction is one of the most common ways that shapes and simple shapes become complex in nature and humanity, there's something in compositions that are fractal, like this glass image and that last image of an onion, where there's an appeal to the whole thing that is really wonderful. To abstract something, there are a couple of different meanings. One is to take out the key issue in something and show it. The other is to take something and make a composition that has no explicit meaning, like this cliffside that could be ink drawing here. But of course, you can also take an abstraction like looking at the sky and seeing a shape in the sky, and that's a kind of abstraction also. When you look at something like these wrecked cars here, it takes a while to understand what you're looking at, and that's a form of abstraction. All the uses of abstraction can be really powerful. And again, it's a topic for one of the sections of the book. You know, selective focus, another incredibly important compositional tool. How do you determine what the important part of the composition is? One of the mechanisms in photography for doing that is to use selective sharpness. Don't bury the lead. Lead is a newspaper term for the important part of a story. It's important as photographers that we understand what our images are about. What is it here in this image that we want to focus on? So that's the lead. Don't bury the lead. Don't hide it. Don't hide your light under a bush. If you know what's important about an image, sometimes it's obvious. This is about two rainbows, a double rainbow. This bristlecone pine here is probably about the circular star trails. And Sky Rock here, location to be undisclosed, is of course mostly about the wonderful pictograms there. But so other times it's not so clear what the lead is. The lead is not necessarily something that's covering the photo. The top of the Golden Gate Bridge here is the lead in this photo, but it's not, you know, it's not dominating the photo. It's a small part of it. Vanishing points perspective. The idea here, we see things typically with single point perspective. We've been taught to see that for hundreds of years now, but you don't have to be content really in your images with single point perspective. You can have multiple point perspective in images. If you scooch a little, you can change the perspective in your image. And there are various mechanisms for understanding how to work with perspective in an image and how to work with scale, as in this image. The size of our camp there in this cave gives an indication of the scale of the cave. The image here in Da Nang, Vietnam, shows old ways of doing things, new ways of doing things, along with a vanishing point perspective down to the wonderful modern bridge there back behind the old ones. And here's perspective in a road in Nevada heading down to a vanishing point there. again, here, there are a couple of different vanishing points, the road, the poles, and it's interesting to play with that in that image. And of course, I waited for a car to come along so that I had a break in the perspective on the road, because otherwise I thought it would be boring. So I wanted to make a composition that was more exciting. You know, so David Hockney, while in some ways has made some pretty great photographic images by combining Polaroids into multiple point perspectives, is a little sardonic about photography. There's nothing wrong with photography if you don't mind the perspective of a paralyzed cyclops, meaning you hold the camera one place, you get one perspective, but I really don't entirely feel that's right, because you can move the camera around and have all kinds of perspectives and vanishing points. And you can, and I do. But that said, part of our job as a guide in photography, along with not burying the lead, is to understand where the perspectives are and to guide the viewer's eye down them, like this pier in the fog in Cayucas, Mid-Coast, California, where clearly the eye goes down to the vanishing point at the right of the pier. This old railway bridge here, it's got a vanishing point down at the bottom of it. And inspiration for this Photoshop composite are the paintings of Rene Magritte. So you have a train track that's going through a mountain panorama, and then back out to the original train track. So every photograph is a conversation, at least between the photographer and the viewer. And one way you can look at it as a conversation is to include portraiture in your photographs. As you do, it's the eye of the subject looking at the viewer or the photographer, or both. So this is a three-way conversation really here. And my suggestion with portraits is to focus on the eyes. Vocabulary of composition, what's meaningful to you. For me, a lot of the time, I'm interested in what things look like at night. Here's the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, the Gem El Fana in Marrakesh. I pass over some of the exercises that or thought experiments you'll find in the book, which you have here. These photographs that follow are an answer to the challenge of photograph a pattern that's revealed via a long exposure. What we're talking about here is about half an hour, 30-minute exposures. So these are the violent waves of the Pacific coming in on the great beach of Point Reyes, and the long exposure has tamed them into something that's basically a kind of abstraction. And these are fun images to make. You don't get to make too many of them per session. Definitely when photographing landscapes, look for the patterns, look for the entry points, the exit points, and think of how you work as a process. It's not just a one-shot kind of thing. It's here's what works here, here's what moves me about it. How do I go back and do it again? What's different in all these things? With this photograph of star trails from the floor of Death Valley, you see me in my tent. It's about 5 hours worth of exposures. And what typically I'm going to do with something like this is I'm going to set up the camera, the tripod, an intervalometer, put everything on autopilot. Then I went into the tent, turned the headlamp on and read for a little, and then let it do its thing while I'm just out there. So I'm moving here pretty quickly because I think we have a bit of a time limit here, and I want to make sure I go through everything. This is my tulip pano that is the forever postage stamp you can get either online or at the post offices in the United States. Unfortunately, I do not get a sales commission, but I'm still very proud of it. And this is the another postage stamp, the sunflower bouquet here. And the post office also produced a gift pack of cards of my work. So you can buy that online at the USPS site. It comes with a sheet of the tulip pano stamps, as well as, I think, 10 of each note card. And here are some lightbox images. You know, perhaps my favorite quote in the book is another Ansel Adams. You don't make a photograph just with a camera. You bring to the act of photography all the pictures you've seen, the books you've read, the music you've heard, the people you've loved. Ansel Adams. And as promised, discount codes, Creative Garden Photography. You can use the general code H Davis 40 or the code Garden 40 here for this book. And the Creative Black and White book, H Davis 40. I'm sure that Damon will reinforce this in the chat box with the H Davis 40 discount code. And please write me. I'm accessible. Here's a whole set of information about me. My email address, my Instagram feed, my channel on YouTube. You can subscribe to emails on my website. A lot of recorded webinars on my website as well. And at this point, Damon, if you're up for it, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let's go to the Q&A.
Yeah, so I think we've got 10 minutes, Harold, around 10 minutes. If folks have questions, please do put those in the Q&A box. And I just saw a comment actually from Ricardo, who was saying, this is really getting my creative juices flowing, Harold. And following on from that, I was wondering what inspires you to continue on your own creative journey?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, of course, I like to travel, so traveling helps me with being creative. I try to be, thank you for the question, Damon. I have a lot going on in my life. I've got a wonderful spouse. I wouldn't be here without Phyllis. Some of you perhaps have encountered her in our own webinars. I have 4 kids. They've been at home since March 2020, basically, which has been quite interesting. So I like to play. You know, I bring my iPhone camera with me wherever I go, and even if I'm not making serious photographs, I do snapshots for fun. So I try to live life as the fullest. I think what that Ansel Adams quote said is it's not just about the technical act of being a photographer and taking the picture. You know, a truism here is you want to take better pictures, stand in front of more interesting things. You want to take really better pictures, become a more interesting person. So I try to work at all aspects of that. I also think that teaching feeds my images and writing feeds my images. Obviously, I write a lot. I bill myself as a writer as well as a photographer. And I recommend everyone try writing about your photography. You'll be amazed at how much that helps with the creativity in photography. I've written a blog since 2005, somewhere between 5 and 20 images a month, stories a month, and a lot of them are, some of them are practical, some of them are advertising, but some of them are truly just musings about creativity and the philosophy of photography. So writing is very important. So what next, Damon?
So Harold, Barbara asks, do you have a favorite focal length?
My favorite camera is the camera I have with me. You know, when I'm working on a light box, I use my Zeiss Otis 55mm lens almost always. You want a prime normal lens for that. It's a square lens. I've got a great, interesting lens that's a wide-angle macro probe. That there were a few of the images in the presentation that were close-ups of flowers that were made with it. Very interesting, exotic lens. I like that one a lot. And I also enjoy using a fisheye lens, an extreme wide angle. A 15 millimeter rectilinear fisheye is one of my favorite lenses. I mean, seriously, my favorite lens is the lens I'm using. Great exercise. So pick a lens, fixed focal length, go out there with it. Don't switch, just use it. It's a very revealing thing to do. Thanks for the good question.
Thanks, Harold. We've got a question from Scott. And if you can cast your mind back here, what process in Photoshop did you use to create the curled planes in your composites?
So I get that question a lot. The best thing to do is to Google creating a curl in Photoshop, and there's a lot of online information about the procedures. Essentially, it's the transformation menu.
Okay, thank you. And Barbara, again, actually, what advice have you for a photographer who cannot travel?
Oh, I'm so happy not traveling too, Barbara. It's a great question, but there's a universe in our backyard. I mean, it's like there's a world, as William Blake said, in a grain of sand. There's a world in a water drop. I was pretty happy in the year 2020, where all traveling ended, with photographing in my backyard. You can find it. Just don't think of it as a limitation. Think of it as an experience and a way to go for your inner creativity. Get a light box. Watch some of my webinars in doing light box photography and experiment with that. I love to travel, but when and if I can't travel, that's okay too for me. But thank you. It's a good question. One should not feel limited by external circumstances. Creativity is only limited by oneself.
Thanks, Harold. So we have a question from Rod. My lack of understanding is the direction in leading lines. How do you get the viewer to distinguish entry or exit?
Well, that's a great question. How do you get the viewer to distinguish? I mean, it's my first reaction hearing this question was, it's something that happens. So it may not be entirely in your control, but look at it this way, or think of it this way. If you look at something, you start somewhere, right? Our human vision is not set to take in everything all at once, all the time. I mean, you look at an image, you start somewhere, usually, and the theory of this is that the first thing you'll go to is bright color. So if you have an image with a splotch of bright color, that's where you're going to start. If there are no bright colors, if it's a slightly monotonic image in some ways, then you go to what's sharp. And color and sharpness are things you can control, okay? There are ways to control sharpness in an image where the user doesn't know that's what you're doing. You can manipulate the user that way. Once you have an entry point in that way, let's say either by color and sharpness, and both of those work pretty well, incidentally, you can then lead them on with lines. Now, I'm saying this as though you're creating everything in the image. And of course, you're not. You're taking a slice of the world a lot of the time, depending on what you're doing. So when you're doing the slice of the world, what you have to do is observe. Okay, you observe. Here, I've got this flower with a center. I look at it. The way I look at it is I go down to the center of the flower, then I go up, then I go down. That's fine. That's great. But there you have the entry and the exit point.
Thank you, Harold. This is a quick one. Harold, where can we find your blog? Is one of the questions.
digitalfieldguide.com/blog, or look up Harold Davis blog in Google.
Thank you. And then I think we've got a couple more minutes. One other question here. What is different about your approach to composition in the new book, Harold?
So a lot of composition books are fairly rule bound or formula bound. Maybe they don't call them rules, maybe they call them formulas. I try very hard not to say this is about your creativity and your process and is a conversation and depends upon your inner being as much as your outer being and any rules. But to the extent that there is solid technical information in my book, it's the theory and inspiration for it comes from the fields of design, ranging from software design to visual design to creative design, things like book design. And I use the ideas that come from there because I say, look, a two-dimensional photograph is absolutely a rendering via design of a three-dimensional world. And therefore, if we're going to create a pleasing composition, we can use these principles. And I don't believe anybody else has taken that approach. I think it's useful. I think if you seriously want to become a more creative practitioner of composition, you will find it valuable. Some of what I do in the book is open-ended. I don't say this is how to do it. I say this is what to think about, where you may begin thinking and how you may enrich your practice. But I don't tell you the end point.
Great, thank you. So I think that's good, Harold. I think we're at the well, we're beyond the hour, so we've done well here. Do you have any closing comments before we end the session?
Thank you very much, everybody. If I can help you become a more creative photographer, that would give me a great deal of pleasure. Please go out there, make a great deal of images. The world is a wonderful, wonderful, beautiful place that has a lot of darkness in it at times. What we need is to, by practicing our craft, our art, we are making the world a better place, not a nasty place. And just remember to embrace the joy and embrace your inner creativity. And I love you all very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Harold. And thanks so much for a great presentation. And thanks to all the attendees who've tuned in from all over the globe today and tonight. So wonderful. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Damon.
See you soon.